Yesterday was the trade deadline in the NBA, and while it wasn't exactly one of the better trade deadlines that we've ever seen and that exciting overall, we did have that insane one blockbuster deal between the 76ers and the Brooklyn Nets, with James Harden being sent to the Philadelphia 76ers along with Paul Millsap. In exchange, the Nets got Ben Simmons, who, as we know, has been sitting out all of this year because of his frustration with the Sixers organization and fans, and also being sent to Brooklyn was Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, and 2 first-round picks in the future. So overall, this was definitely a blockbuster deal, and I'm assuming that pretty much about 2/3 of you guys watching this video think that either the Nets won this trade or that the trade was basically a win-win scenario for both teams involved. But I'm going to come out with kind of a decently hot take here and say that the Sixers won this trade, and actually they definitely won this trade, and that's what I'm going to be analyzing and explaining in today's video. We've kind of had a day for this to set in, and I've looked at this trade, and I really do think that the Sixers are the team that are going to be benefiting from this trade, and that the Brooklyn Nets are actually going to regret making this deal down the road into their future of their franchise. So let's get into the analysis and why I think the Sixers won this trade. So first, let's start off by talking about James Harden and how he is still definitely a top 10, probably even top 8 player in this league, despite him having what many consider kind of a down season because he's not scoring nearly the same as he used to, especially with his days in Houston. Harden is still having a pretty good season, especially as a playmaker, and I think he's actually going to fit in pretty well with this Sixers team. So far this year, like I said, Harden's done a great job being a facilitator. He's averaging over 10 assists per game so far this year. His overall IQ has really improved really over the course of his career. He's playing pass first, and this year, along with last year, he's shown how he's really maturing as a player, and he's becoming definitely a better playmaker, and he's showing that he can be not only just put into situations where he's the number one guy, but we saw with the Nets how he can definitely function as a second or even third option at times. He has to have the ball in his hands a lot, but he doesn't exactly have to be scoring when the ball's in his hands, and he's matured a lot as a player. And early in the year, I actually did make a video about kind of the interesting evolution of James Harden's game. Be sure to check that out as well for more in-depth analysis on this. But like I said, he's a really good playmaker this year. I think this is going to fit in well with the Sixers. And as we know, his scoring has definitely been down this season, and he's been in a slump recently and has also dealt with a few injuries throughout the course of this season. But Harden, as we know, can still be one of the better scorers in the NBA when he needs to be. And so far this year, he still is averaging 22.5 points per game on 33% from 3 and a 57.5% true shooting, which is actually slightly above league average for this season. So it's not like he's been a complete liability or anything. Plus, not to mention, he's actually been a pretty decent defender this year as well. He's put in effort on that end of the floor. Results are coming out, and I think people really do need to realize that just because James Harden is not that same player that he was with the Houston Rockets and even last season with the Brooklyn Nets, he is still a top 10 player in this league, and he can provide a lot of value for the Sixers team. And when I first heard about the rumors about the Sixers potentially wanting to go out and get Harden, I didn't exactly think that would work very well with a Harden and Embiid duo, because Embiid obviously is playing like an MVP candidate this season. He's a dominant post player and doesn't exactly do a lot more than that on the offensive side of the floor other than get the ball and go get himself a bucket. And I didn't really think he would fit in well with Harden because Embiid is certainly not a pick and roll center. He doesn't exactly function that way as a basketball player. Again, he functions more in the post, scoring on his own, but I think this is actually going to be good for the Sixers and Embiid to potentially get into a little bit more kind of team action, as potentially Harden and Embiid running some pick and rolls together, Embiid maybe popping out to the three-point line, shooting some more high percentage shots there. That top of the key 3 is definitely a pretty high percentage shot for Embiid, and in the clutch time in games, the Sixers don't even have to rely that much on Embiid anymore. He can still probably be their number one guy down the stretch in games, but Harden could also be that guy for them that goes and gets them a bucket down the stretch if he's using that step back 3. And overall, I think that Harden's playmaking and what he's shown this year, his ability to be a good overall playmaker with a high IQ, and Embiid's pure scoring ability ability, I think these will end up fitting pretty well together, not to mention that the Sixers do have a decent supporting cast surrounding them. The Sixers have been pretty much a top 5 team in the East all year, and while I don't want to give them credit and I don't really like them as a team, I think that they did do a good job of getting Harden here, and I think Harden is going to help, especially their offensive flow in the run of this team for this particular season. Now, for those of you who think the Nets won this trade because they got a big haul back, you probably think that everything that I've said throughout today's video means nothing because I haven't talked about their return yet. And the thing you have to realize about this is Ben Simmons was not playing for the Sixers at all over the course of this entire season, and he wasn't going to and didn't plan to at all until he got traded. So he wasn't providing any value for this team. So when you think of it logically from the Sixers' point of view, really they are only giving up Seth Curry, Drummond, and a couple of picks to get Harden, which if you basically take Ben Simmons out of it from the Sixers' perspective, they obviously won this trade. Now, of course, the Nets did get Simmons, but when you look at a Sixers perspective for just a little while longer here, and then I'll talk about the Nets eventually, but the Sixers, they gave up a player who was literally never going to play for their team ever again and wasn't going to provide any value for them. And really overall, the whole Ben Simmons situation was just a complete roller coaster, and I made multiple videos on this channel about it, but to sum it up, the Sixers pretty much this whole season have been, or at least should have been, desperate to get rid of Ben Simmons, and because of this, his value was so low, and I thought they were going to have to end up giving him up for literally something like a role player and a first-round pick at best. And the fact that they were able to get a top 10 player out of this, obviously they had to put together a package, but I really think the Sixers really finessed this whole situation here to get out of this Ben Simmons drama with being able to add a superstar to their team and potentially go for a championship push in the 2021 and 22 season. So overall, I think this is going to work out for the Sixers from their perspective, adding Harden for a Harden and Embiid duo with a great playmaker and a great scorer, one of the best playmakers and scorers in the league with Harden and Embiid, a decent supporting cast around them, and still a good defensive system. I think that is definitely going to help their team and help them push for a championship run this season. Now, when we look at this from a Nets perspective, because a lot of you are probably confused that not only am I saying that the Nets didn't win this trade, but I'm not even saying it's a win-win scenario for them. When you look at this from a Nets perspective, you have to realize that this is a lot more complicated than just adding a lot of depth to their roster. This is a team right now who was expected to be easily the best team in the league this season with their big three, and now all of a sudden with this whole situation with Kyrie Irving obviously only being able to play away games and Kevin Durant out of the lineup, this team has literally lost 9 straight games due to the fact that they cannot get any type of team chemistry going and any flow going really on both ends of the floor. And while they are going to improve defensively from this trade, you do have to realize that this trade is going to hurt them on the offensive side of the floor, and they are going to have to completely change their offensive system with already having tons of chemistry problems with this whole Kyrie on and off situation. Kevin Durant is still not going to be coming back for a while most likely, and even when he does come back, the Nets offensive system before this trade pretty much evolved around James Harden, and now they have to completely change it. The main point guard on this team is going to be Kyrie, who can only play half the games, and unless he doesn't get vaccinated at some point, this team is still going to be a mess chemistry wise, worse than we've ever seen. And even when they had the 3 ball dominant superstars, they were able to find a way to make that work. But now one of them's gone. A guy in Ben Simmons is coming in, who, by the way, still is not obviously developed a jump shot, still probably is going to have confidence issues out there on the court, and may prove to still be potentially at times hurting teams' offenses. He's now being added in instead of Harden, and Kyrie is only being able to play half the games, and KD has injury problems. So you have to understand that this Nets offense is still going to be a complete mess after this this trade that's happened to bring in Ben Simmons, and even though they are getting some good role players like Seth Curry who can shoot it well, that still doesn't take away from the fact that they're going to have to completely change their offensive system. And as a team that was expected to win a championship this season, and I think that was the expectation all the way up until this trade happened yesterday, the fact that this is happening to a team that had that kind of expectation, I don't see how you can look at this trade and say the Nets won. Maybe it does help their future because they wouldn't have got Harden back anyway, but that was not the goal for this team. The goal was for them to win a championship, and now here they are sitting with about 35 games left in the season on a huge losing streak and having to completely remake their offensive system with still lots of chemistry issues with this team on the offensive side of the floor. The overall situation with this trade is really bizarre and kind of complicated, but when you really look at this situation and analyze what it means for both teams for right now, which going into this season and pretty much up until even just before the trade happened yesterday, both of these teams were in win now mode and trying to win a championship. And the fact that the Sixers got better and took a more productive step towards moving towards that championship, and the Nets moved back and are still going to have lots of chemistry issues, like I mentioned, I don't see how you can look at this and say the Sixers did not win this trade and the Nets did not lose this trade. In my opinion, the Sixers won this, and even if this is going to benefit the Nets in the future, I don't really think that means anything because this team had one of, if not the best offensive big three that we have ever seen, and they blew it. So in my opinion, the Nets lost this trade. Them moving towards their future was probably the wrong decision. They should have tried to just figure it out with what they had, because once KD came back, if they still had Harden, and even if Kyrie was playing half the games, this is probably the most offensive talented team going into the playoffs in the Eastern Conference this year. So meanwhile, while they're moving towards that and making kind of a mess in this team, in my opinion, the Sixers are moving towards that ultimate goal of trying to win a championship this season and putting together one of, if not the best duos in the NBA that is probably going to work pretty well together. So like I said, overall the situation is complicated, but that's all I've got for you guys in terms of analysis for today's video. Be sure to leave your comments down below. I'm really curious to see what you guys think of this trade. Who do you think won the trade? Who do you think lost? Do you guys think that both teams won this trade? What do you think it means for them in this season and their futures? So be sure to leave your comments down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all next video.